The Bismarck Sea, March 1943. A place where the sky itself seemed to burn, and the ocean swallowed men whole. For most, it was just another nameless corner of the Pacific War. But for one man, Lieutenant John "Lucky" Lawson, it became the place where rules were broken, fear was forgotten, and history itself was rewritten. In those days, the Allied campaign in the Pacific was hanging by a thread. Japanese convoys were still resupplying their forces in New Guinea, sending thousands of soldiers and tons of equipment through waters protected by destroyers and anti-aircraft guns. The Americans had tried everything: high-altitude bombing, torpedoes, strafing runs, but the results were always the same. The Japanese convoys kept getting through. Every raid ended with the same radio message: no significant damage, heavy resistance, returning to base. But then came Lawson, a man who didn't like hearing the word impossible. He wasn't the kind of pilot who followed the rulebook. He believed that the only way to win was to do what the enemy didn't expect. And what the Japanese least expected was a bomber flying at the same height as their mast. March 2, 1943, the beginning of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 8 Japanese troop transports, escorted by destroyers, were spotted heading toward New Guinea. If they reached their destination, it would mean thousands of new enemy troops on the ground, and the Allies couldn't afford that. At the Allied airfield in Port Moresby, pilots gathered around a map spread across a table. The mission briefing was simple: stop the convoy at all costs. But behind that simple order lay a death sentence. The Japanese convoy was heavily armed, and high-altitude bombing hadn't worked before. The odds were brutal. Lawson stood near the edge of the group, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the map. He'd been thinking for weeks about a tactic no one dared to try. Not from a textbook, not from command, but from pure instinct. He turned to his co-pilot and said quietly, "If we can't hit them from above, we'll hit them from the sea." That night, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, Lawson and his crew prepared their B-25 bomber. They stripped out extra weight, loaded 500-pound bombs, and modified the release system for low-altitude drops. It wasn't official. It wasn't authorized. In fact, it was forbidden. But for Lawson, it was the only chance to make a difference. At dawn, the engines roared to life. One by one, the bombers lifted off, climbing just high enough to clear the jungle canopy before leveling out. Their flight path took them low, dangerously low, across the Pacific waves. At times, they flew so close to the water that the spray hit the windows. The plan was insane. They would fly at 200 feet, skim the ocean surface, and release their bombs in a skip, letting them bounce across the water like a stone until they slammed into the side of a ship. It was a technique no one had tested in combat before. If it failed, they would die before even pulling the trigger. As the sun rose, the black smoke of the Japanese convoy came into view. Destroyers cut through the waves, guns scanning the skies. They were ready for high-altitude bombers, not for what was coming. Inside the lead B-25, the air was thick with tension. Lawson kept his eyes locked on the horizon, hands steady on the controls. The intercom crackled. Enemy ships in sight, multiple destroyers, transports behind them. Lawson's reply was calm: "We stay low. No formation breaks. Follow my lead." The Japanese gunners spotted them too late. When the first bomber appeared above the waves, they thought it was a fighter. Then came another, and another, until the entire squadron of bombers was racing toward them just feet above the sea. One Japanese captain screamed into his radio, "They come like demons from the sea." Within the first hour, 3 transport ships were sinking. One destroyer had lost its bow, and still the Americans kept coming. But victory came at a price. Lawson's bomber shook violently as enemy fire ripped through the fuselage. The right engine began smoking, oil splattering across the glass. The tail gunner shouted, "We're hit!" Lawson didn't flinch. "Feather the prop. Hold her steady." He pushed the throttle to maximum and lined up another run. A second target loomed ahead, another transport, trying to escape behind a screen of smoke. Lawson dived again. The bomb released perfectly. It skipped twice, then detonated directly under the ship's hull. The explosion lifted the vessel out of the water before splitting it in two. The entire crew stared in disbelief. It was working. The forbidden tactic was turning the tide. By the end of the first day, the Japanese convoy was shattered. For ships gone, 2 burning, others drifting helplessly. Lawson returned to base with holes in his wings and barely enough fuel to land. When his bomber rolled to a stop, ground crew ran forward, cheering. He climbed out, exhausted but alive, covered in soot and sweat. A major rushed to him, demanding, "What altitude were you bombing from?" Lawson just smiled. 200 feet. The major stared. "That's suicide." "Not if you hit first," Lawson replied. Tracer fire lit up the air. Explosions erupted all around. But at that altitude, the Japanese guns couldn't depress low enough to hit them effectively. Shells tore through the water, missing by inches. Lawson dove even lower, the altimeter needle dipping dangerously near zero. The ocean blurred beneath him, whitecaps flashing past at 250 miles per hour. Through the windshield, he could see the target. A massive Japanese transport, its deck bristling with guns. He waited. Closer. Closer. Then, at the perfect moment, bombs away! The 500-pound bomb dropped, skipped once, twice, then slammed into the ship's hull with the force of a thunderclap. A split second later, the freighter erupted in a fireball that shook the air. Flames and debris filled the sky as Lawson pulled up, barely clearing the ship's mast. Behind him, his crew cheered. The radio crackled with other pilots shouting, "Direct hit. She's going down." The sea was on fire. The Japanese convoy fell into chaos. Destroyers swerved to avoid collisions, anti-aircraft gunners spinning their weapons wildly. Everywhere they looked, bombers were coming in low and fast, their machine guns shredding decks, their bombs ripping through steel. Word spread quickly through the base. Pilots who had watched the failure of high-altitude raids for months now had a new weapon, one that actually worked. The next morning, every crew wanted to try Lawson's method. On day 2, the attacks continued. The surviving Japanese ships tried to form a tight defensive circle, anti-aircraft guns ready. But the Americans came in waves, B-25s and Beaufighters diving so low their propellers sliced the spray off the water. The Japanese gunners fired wildly, filling the sky with smoke and lead, but it was too late. The bombs kept skipping, hitting, exploding. By noon, the convoy was a burning graveyard. Lawson flew 3 more sorties that day. Each time he pushed closer to the edge, lower, faster, deadlier. Each time he came back with more holes in his plane and fewer bombs in his bay. By sunset, 8 enemy ships were gone. 4 still remained. He wasn't done yet. That night, as mechanics patched up the battered bombers, Lawson sat on a crate, watching the horizon. The ocean glowed faintly with the fires of the ships they destroyed. Someone handed him a tin cup of coffee. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the sky and said quietly, "Tomorrow we finish it." At dawn on the 3rd day, the bombers took off again. The Japanese convoy was now desperate, crippled, but not defeated. Their destroyers had formed a shield around the last transports, guns aimed at every direction. Smoke hung over the sea like a shroud. As Lawson's formation approached, enemy fire erupted instantly. Flak bursts filled the air. The B-25s weaved and dove, flying through walls of smoke and flame. Lawson's co-pilot shouted, "We're not getting through that." "Yes, we are," Lawson said. He pushed the nose down. The bomber dropped to barely 150 feet. The altimeter screamed, but Lawson didn't care. He lined up a final target, a massive freighter still moving at full speed. Machine guns rattled. Bullets punched through the fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke. But Lawson's voice stayed calm. "Hold on, hold on." Then the bomb released, one last perfect skip, and the freighter disappeared in a wall of orange fire that turned the sky into day. The shockwave hit the bomber like a hammer. The right engine burst into flames. The crew shouted, "We're going down!" But Lawson fought the controls, keeping the plane level. He limped it back toward base, one engine dead, the other coughing, the sea below reflecting the burning sky behind them. When they finally reached land, the landing gear wouldn't lower. Lawson brought the bomber in belly first, skidding across the dirt strip in a shower of sparks. When the plane stopped, silence filled the air. Then cheers erupted. He'd made it home barely. 12 ships sunk in 72 hours. Thousands of enemy troops lost. A Japanese supply route destroyed. And all because one man dared to fly where no one was supposed to. But for Lawson, it wasn't glory he felt. It was something else, the weight of what he had seen. The screams, the flames, the faces of men jumping into burning water. War didn't make heroes. It made survivors. When the official report was filed, Command called the tactic unofficial. They refused to endorse it, said it violated altitude regulations. But every pilot on the base knew the truth. The forbidden run had worked. And from that day on, every bomber crew learned Lawson's technique. They called it skip bombing, a tactic born not from orders, but from one man's defiance. That night, as the jungle winds howled and the ocean burned in the distance, Lawson stood alone beside his battered plane. He placed his hand on the fuselage, still warm from the landing. "They told me it was forbidden," he whispered. "But it got the job done." In the end, the Bismarck Sea became his legacy. Not a battlefield, but a testament that sometimes the difference between failure and victory is one man willing to break the rules. And in those 3 days of fire, John Lawson didn't just destroy 12 ships. He changed the way the war was fought. Forever.by March 4, 1943, the skies above the Bismarck Sea had become a living inferno. The Japanese convoy, 8 destroyers and 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops, was moving like a steel serpent through the dark waves, headed for New Guinea. But the Allies had seen them coming, and waiting in the air was a squadron that didn't believe in the word impossible. Lieutenant John "Lucky" Lawson sat in the cockpit of his B-25 Mitchell bomber, his hands gripping the control yoke. He could feel the tremor of the twin engines beneath his feet, like the heartbeat of a living beast ready to strike. The order had come in just minutes before takeoff. Hit them low. Don't give them time to react. But Lawson knew what that meant. It meant going down to 200 feet, maybe lower, a maneuver that wasn't just dangerous, it was strictly forbidden by command. Air doctrine of the time was clear. Medium bombers attacked from altitude at least 6,000 feet or more. Going low meant suicide. Japanese ships were armed with dozens of anti-aircraft guns. One mistake, 1 second too late, and a wall of lead would rip a bomber apart before it even dropped its payload. But Lawson wasn't one for rules. Not here. Not today. He glanced over at his co-pilot, Lieutenant Henry "Red" Watson, who looked pale but determined. 200 feet? Watson said through the roar of the engines. Lawson smirked, tightening his oxygen mask. 200 feet, or we don't come home. Down below, the Japanese fleet sliced through the waves in perfect formation. Their lookouts spotted the incoming dots in the sky, American bombers, glinting against the rising sun. Alarms blared across the decks. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons upward, ready to turn the air into a storm of death. The first Allied wave came in high, the standard run. Dozens of bombs fell, splashing into the sea, missing their targets. Explosions thundered in the water, but the Japanese ships kept moving. They were fast, disciplined, and deadly. From the ground, it looked like the Americans had failed. That's when Lawson's voice crackled through the radio. "All Mitchells, follow my lead. We're going low." The command center back at Port Moresby couldn't believe what they were hearing. Pilots were trained to avoid suicidal dives, but now this one man was telling his squadron to go under the radar, literally. To skim the waves and attack like torpedoes from the sky. Lawson pushed the yoke forward. His bomber began to drop. 5,000 feet. 3,000. 1,000. 500. The altimeter needle trembled as the sea rushed closer. Spray from the ocean whipped against the glass. "Hold steady," Lawson shouted. Now, they were flying so low that the Japanese gunners had to tilt their barrels down to aim. A wall of tracers tore across the sky. Bullets ripped into the bomber's fuselage, sparks flying, metal screaming. The plane shook violently, but Lawson didn't pull up. He held his line, eyes locked on the black silhouette of a destroyer dead ahead. Steady, steady. Bombs away. The B-25 lurched upward as 4 500-pound bombs dropped from its belly. Too low for the fuses to arm properly by normal standards. But these weren't normal pilots. The bombs struck the side of the destroyer and detonated almost instantly. A column of water and fire erupted skyward, drenching the bomber as it flew past. The Japanese ship broke apart in two. One down. Lawson's voice came over the intercom. Calm but electric. That's how we do it, boys. Keep them low. Make it count. One by one, the other bombers followed suit. The sky became a chaotic dance of death. Planes diving low, explosions lighting up the waves, ships turning desperately to dodge. The Japanese gunners tried to track them, but they couldn't react fast enough. The Mitchells were coming in below their firing arcs, a tactic the enemy had never seen before. Within minutes, 2 more ships were ablaze. Smoke billowed across the horizon like a dark curtain, but the bombers kept coming. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. In one attack run, Lucky Lawson's squadron had rewritten the rulebook of aerial warfare. But the victory came at a cost. Lawson's bomber had taken several hits. Hydraulic fluid was leaking, and one of the engines was sputtering. The tail gunner shouted that the rear turret was jammed. Lawson looked back. The ocean behind them was littered with fire, wreckage, and sinking ships. "We can't go back up," Watson warned. Lawson nodded grimly. "Then we go around." They looped wide over the burning convoy, smoke curling beneath their wings. The radio was alive with shouting. Some pilots celebrating, others calling for rescue. The Japanese were still firing, their ships now desperate to protect what remained. But Lawson wasn't done. Not yet. Through the haze, he spotted another destroyer turning north, trying to escort survivors. It was damaged but still afloat. Lawson's instincts screamed at him to turn back to base. But his heart said otherwise. "We finish it," he said quietly. He brought the plane around again. The altimeter ticked downward. 400 feet, 300, 200. Red Watson muttered. "You're out of your damn mind." Lawson grinned. Wouldn't be the first time. They came in fast, the sea a blur beneath them. Tracer rounds zipped by like fiery comets. The bomber was hit again. A burst tore through the right wing, spraying sparks across the cockpit. Lawson ignored it. "Hold her steady. Hold her now." The final bombs dropped, 2 perfect hits. The destroyer erupted in a ball of flame that tore its superstructure apart. The shockwave slammed into Lawson's bomber, nearly flipping it. Red screamed, "We're hit!" The instruments flickered. The right engine burst into smoke. But somehow, Lawson pulled the plane level again. They limped back across the burning sea, the wind screaming through bullet holes, fuel leaking from the wings. The crew sat in stunned silence, watching the inferno fade behind them. "Did we just do that?" Watson muttered. Lawson's reply was quiet, almost reverent. "We didn't just bomb them, Red. We changed the way this war is fought." That day, the Allies confirmed the impossible. A 200-foot bombing run, once forbidden, now legendary, had sunk 12 Japanese ships in 3 days. It became one of the most effective tactics in the Pacific War, low-level skip bombing, perfected by the very pilots who weren't supposed to try it. And at the center of it all was one man, Lucky Lawson, whose defiance turned desperation into innovation. As his crippled plane touched down back at base, ground crews rushed to meet them. The bomber's nose was shredded, the fuselage riddled with holes, yet the crew walked out alive. Lawson climbed down from the cockpit, oil streaking his face, exhaustion in his eyes. A commanding officer ran up, shouting, "Lieutenant Lawson, what the hell do you call that maneuver?" Lawson wiped his brow, looked at the burning horizon, and said simply, "I call it doing what needed to be done." The officer stared at him, half furious, half amazed. And for a long moment nobody spoke. Then, from the hangar, someone began to clap. Slow, deliberate. Within seconds, the entire base was applauding. The forbidden run had just become the stuff of legend. But what Lawson didn't know was that his defiance had just painted a target on his back. Because even in war, courage can be punished. When the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the Pacific was changed forever. 12 Japanese ships gone. Thousands of enemy troops lost to the waves. And the secret behind that victory? A single act of defiance, one pilot's decision to fly lower than any bomber was ever meant to go. But back at the Allied base in Port Moresby, not everyone was celebrating. The field still echoed with cheers as Lawson's battered B-25 rolled to a stop. Mechanics rushed in, eyes wide at the bullet-riddled fuselage. One man muttered, "She's more whole than metal." Lucky Lawson climbed down, limping slightly, exhaustion shadowing his face. The other pilots gathered around, grinning, shouting, "You did it, Lucky! You mad bastard! You actually did it!" Lawson smiled faintly, but his eyes were distant. He could still hear the roar of the engines, the scream of flak, the sea rushing toward him at 200 feet. It didn't feel like glory, felt like survival. That's when the base commander, Colonel Everett Mason, approached, tall, stern, with a face carved from stone. "Lieutenant Lawson," he said sharply. "My office. Now." The celebration died instantly. The crowd parted as Lawson followed Mason inside. The colonel shut the door, turned, and slammed a folder on the desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lawson didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. We destroyed 12 enemy ships." Mason's voice rose. "You disobeyed direct flight protocol. You risked an entire squadron on an untested maneuver. You were told, never go below 1,000 feet. Lawson stood his ground. "Sir, with respect, the old way wasn't working. We were missing every target. The Japanese were cutting us apart. I did what I had to do." Mason glared, silence stretching like a blade between them. Then, slowly, the colonel leaned back in his chair. His expression softened, but only slightly. "You may have won the battle, Lieutenant, but you've made enemies in higher places than the Japanese." Word spread fast, faster than Lawson could imagine. Within hours, military intelligence officers arrived from General Headquarters. They called it an investigation. In truth, it was punishment disguised as procedure. The report said Lawson had violated tactical orders, risked aircraft, and jeopardized classified missions. The fact that his attack had worked, spectacularly, didn't seem to matter. But outside the paperwork and politics, something else was happening. Every pilot on base now wanted to fly like him. Skip bombing, the technique Lawson had invented by accident and instinct, was suddenly the talk of the Pacific. Crews practiced at low altitudes, learning to make their bombs skip like stones across the water into enemy ships. For the first time, the Allies had a way to strike the Japanese Navy where it hurt most. In just 3 days, Lucky Lawson's forbidden run had become official doctrine. Still, the price was heavy. 2 of his squadron's planes never came back. Good men, friends, lost to the ocean below. At night, Lawson sat alone on the airstrip, watching the waves crash in the distance, listening to the faraway thunder of bombers heading out. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind. "Was it worth it?" he murmured. Red Watson, his co-pilot, walked up quietly. "They're saying command might ground you." Lawson exhaled smoke, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Wouldn't be the first time someone didn't like how I fly." Watson smirked. "Yeah, but this time you made history. But history doesn't protect heroes, not in war." A week later, orders came down. Lawson was being reassigned, not promoted, not decorated. Reassigned to tactical evaluation. It was military code for exile, a polite way to remove a man who'd embarrassed command by being right. When he reported to the new airfield, it was little more than a mud strip surrounded by jungle. No glory, no reporters, no recognition. Just the endless hum of mosquitoes and the dull ache of silence. Lawson didn't complain. He never had. He simply looked at his battered flight jacket, the same one he'd worn during the run, and whispered, "We'll find a way back." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Japanese command was reeling. The loss at the Bismarck Sea was catastrophic. one of the worst naval defeats in their history. Intelligence reports said Admiral Kasaka had ordered new anti-air tactics, heavier guns, tighter formations, all designed to stop those terrifying low-level attacks. But the Allies had already moved faster. Still, the price was heavy. 2 of his squadron's planes never came back. Good men, friends, lost to the ocean below. At night, Lawson sat alone on the airstrip, watching the waves crash in the distance, listening to the faraway thunder of bombers heading out. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind. "Was it worth it?" he murmured. Red Watson, his co-pilot, walked up quietly. "They're saying command might ground you." Lawson exhaled smoke, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Wouldn't be the first time someone didn't like how I fly." Watson smirked. "Yeah, but this time you made history." But history doesn't protect heroes, not in war. A week later, orders came down. Lawson was being reassigned, not promoted, not decorated. Reassigned to tactical evaluation. It was military code for exile, a polite way to remove a man who'd embarrassed command by being right. When he reported to the new airfield, it was little more than a mud strip surrounded by jungle. No glory, no reporters, no recognition. Just the endless hum of mosquitoes and the dull ache of silence. Lawson didn't complain. He never had. He simply looked at his battered flight jacket, the same one he'd worn during the run, and whispered, "We'll find a way back." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Japanese command was reeling. The loss at the Bismarck Sea was catastrophic, one of the worst naval defeats in their history. Intelligence reports said Admiral Kasaka had ordered new anti-air tactics, heavier guns, tighter formations, all designed to stop those terrifying low-level attacks. But the Allies had already moved faster. By April 1943, every squadron in the Southwest Pacific had been trained in skip bombing. The results were devastating. Convoy after convoy was shredded. The Japanese began to fear the low rumble of engines more than anything else. And though Lawson wasn't officially credited, every pilot knew where the tactic had come from. They called it the lucky run. Back at the jungle airstrip, Lawson received a coded message one humid morning. It was short, just coordinates, and a name, Operation Cartwheel. He stared at the note for a long time, then smiled. "Looks like they're not done with me yet." Operation Cartwheel was massive, a campaign to cut off Japanese strongholds across the Pacific, island by island, base by base. And at its heart were the low-flying bombers, the very tactic born from Lawson's defiance. He was back in the cockpit again, this time leading new recruits. Young men barely out of flight school, nervous but eager. Before takeoff, one of them asked, "Sir, how low do we go?" Lawson grinned, adjusting his goggles. Low enough to scare the devil. The engines roared to life, the planes lifting into the blood-red dawn. They flew through rain, smoke, and chaos. Each run brought them closer to death and victory. During one of those missions, Lawson's bomber was hit. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the fuselage, shattering the controls. Watson yelled, "We're losing her." Lawson fought the yoke, his muscles burning. The plane was going down, fast. "Brace!" he shouted. The Mitchell slammed into the jungle, metal twisting, trees exploding around them. Silence. Then the crackle of fire. Lawson crawled from the wreckage, coughing, his leg broken, uniform torn. Watson was unconscious beside him but alive. The rest of the crew gone. They were deep in enemy territory. For 3 days, Lawson dragged his co-pilot through the jungle, hiding from Japanese patrols, surviving on rainwater and sheer will. He'd faced enemy guns, death from the sky, but nothing compared to this silence. When they were finally rescued by an Australian patrol, Lawson was barely conscious. He woke up weeks later in a field hospital, leg in a cast, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and burnt fuel. The doctor said, "You're lucky to be alive." Lawson smiled weakly. "That's what they call me." Back home, the military finally recognized what he'd done. Skip bombing had changed the Pacific War, and it had started with him. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, but when the ceremony came, He refused to wear dress blues. He stood in his patched flight jacket, saluted once, and walked away before the applause began. He never chased fame. He chased victory, and the lives of the men who still flew. Years later, long after the war, a historian tracked him down. Lawson was living quietly on a farm in Oregon, gray-haired but sharp-eyed. The man asked, "Do you ever regret going low that day?" Lawson looked out across the fields, where the wind moved like the sea. "Regret," he said softly. "No, because sometimes the only way to win is to break the rules." He died in 1961. Not in battle, but in peace, surrounded by the quiet he'd earned. But the legacy of that forbidden run lived on, in every pilot who dared to fly too low, in every bomber that skimmed the waves, in every man who believed courage meant doing what others wouldn't. Because history remembers the victories, but legends, they're born in defiance. The war moved on. The Pacific Front kept shifting, island after island, wave after wave of blood and steel. But something had changed forever after that 200-foot bombing run. A new kind of warfare had been born. Every pilot in the Allied Air Forces now trained for low-level assault not just by instinct but by doctrine. And though his name was rarely mentioned in official briefings, every man who dropped low over the sea carried Lawson's ghost with him. By mid-1943, the skies over the Pacific had become a deadly theater of innovation. Skip bombing, mast-height strafing, wave-hugging runs, all techniques born from one man's defiance, were tearing through Japanese convoys. Reports from the Pacific told the same story again and again. Enemy ships destroyed before reaching target. Minimal losses. Commanders called it tactical evolution. Pilots called it the lucky way. In the Japanese command, fear turned to desperation. Their anti-aircraft defenses had been designed for high-altitude attacks, for the kind of enemy that flew safe. But Lawson had rewritten the rules. His disciples now came in fast, silent, and low below radar, below expectation, below mercy. At Rabaul, one Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "The American bombers now come from the sea itself. We see their reflection before we see the plane. It is like death rising from the waves." By the end of 1943, over 150 Japanese ships had been destroyed through skip bombing, from massive transports to destroyers and troop carriers. The psychological damage was just as severe. Sailors began abandoning ships at the mere sound of low-flying engines. And all of it traced back to a single man who had been nearly court-martialed for reckless flying. But while the war machine moved on, Lucky Lawson was fading from the headlines. New heroes emerged, new battles, new legends. The world forgot his face, but not his idea. Back in the States, he was offered a staff position at Air Force headquarters. He turned it down. Instead, he returned to his unit, now a training squadron, and spent his final months teaching rookies how to survive. He never lectured. He'd simply stand in front of the class and say, "Don't trust the manual. Trust the mission." Those words stuck. Pilots quoted them long after he was gone. In August 1945, the war ended. Tokyo surrendered. The world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Lawson was in a veterans' hospital when he heard the news. He smiled faintly, watching fireworks explode outside the window, bright lights across a quiet sky. For him, there were no cheers, no parades, just silence and the memory of men who never came home. He whispered, almost to himself, "We made it, boys. We made it." But history, as always, was selective. In post-war documentaries and official reports, the credit for skip bombing went to Allied tactical innovation. No single pilot was mentioned by name. Yet among the crews, the ones who had flown through hell and come back, everyone knew. They remembered the first man who had flown lower than fear itself. The one who taught them that courage isn't about orders. It's about instinct. Years passed. By the 1950s, the world had changed again. Jets replaced propellers. New wars replaced old enemies. The veterans of the Pacific grew older, their stories fading like old film reels. But in 1958, something unexpected happened. A young Air Force historian, Captain Daniel Rhodes, was digging through declassified mission reports. He found a file marked Bismarck Sea Tactical Deviation Report. Lawson. The document was short, just 4 pages. But inside was a single line that sent chills down Rhodes' spine. Pilot initiated low-altitude skip-bombing run in direct defiance of standing orders. Resulted in destruction of 12 enemy ships. Rhodes began digging deeper. Interviews with surviving crew members confirmed the impossible, that the tactical deviation had, in fact, changed the entire air strategy of the Pacific War. He published a paper titled, The 200-Foot Miracle. How One Pilot Changed the Tide in the Pacific. It didn't make front-page news, but among military historians, it sparked a quiet revolution. Lawson's name resurfaced not as a troublemaker, but as a pioneer. In 1961, on a small Oregon farm surrounded by fields of wheat, Lawson passed away peacefully in his sleep. He never saw the recognition that came later. But his story didn't die there. A decade after his death, the U.S. Air Force officially added a line to its tactical history records. The development of low-altitude attack doctrine was first demonstrated successfully by Lieutenant Jack Lawson during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, March 1943. One sentence. That was all the world ever gave him. But sometimes one sentence is all it takes to live forever. In the 1980s, a documentary crew visited surviving members of Lawson's old squadron. They were old men now, gray, bent, but still sharp. When asked what made him different, one of them said quietly, "He didn't see fear like the rest of us did. He saw it as a direction." Another added, "You know what made Lucky special? He never wanted to be remembered. He just wanted us to make it home." And yet, somehow, he was remembered. Not by medals or monuments, but by echoes. Every time a pilot drops below the clouds, chasing death to save others, Lawson's spirit is there. Every time someone breaks a rule because doing the right thing means breaking the safe thing, that's him too. Because the truth is, wars aren't won by perfect soldiers. They're won by imperfect men who refuse to give up when logic says they should. Today, in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, there's a small display in a dim corner, easily missed if you're not looking. It holds a dented flight helmet, a faded photograph, and a single quote engraved beneath. Sometimes the only way to win is to fly lower than fear. Visitors rarely stop there for long. Most walk past toward the shiny jets, the famous names, the big machines. But every so often, a young pilot pauses, reads the plaque, and smiles. Because even if they don't know the whole story, they feel it. The defiance, the danger, the echo of valor that still hums in the air.